Igor, there is issue that I would like to discuss, and I guess it's much more sensitive and much more relevant to our sort of in-depth discussion, because we talked about Russia's whatever negligence, as you call it, or the fraud and so on, vis-a-vis the United Nations, right? In terms of Russia's gaining or obtaining membership of the Soviet Union, okay? And actions of Russia are pretty much obvious and clear, but it is absolutely obvious and clear that none of this would happen without some help the UN authorities of the time. So, in particular, I'm sure that this replacement of Soviet Union by Russia in 1991 wouldn't have happened without, again, I put it in quote unquote, assistance from some other members of the UN Security Council, the American administration, so on and so forth. And in fact, there are a lot of voices that are trying to justify that it happened that way, not the other way. People are saying, okay, all of the world was scared, what would happen to the huge nuclear stockpile of the Soviet Union, blah, blah, blah. However, now I think time has come to discuss why was it possible? Why this replacement, quote unquote, was possible at all, because it just goes against any common sense. That's one issue. And the other issue, again, who's responsible and what can be done to change the situation, to rectify this major injustice? Please, yours.
Who is responsible? My first weeks of work at the United Nations back in mid-90s were both very interesting in the terms of my first experience in multilateral diplomacy. And by chance, it happened to be the most multilateral diplomacy I ever witnessed in my life. That is the United Nations, the headquarters. And also the deficiencies. I, civil servant from Ukraine, freshly new independent state, eager to learn, eager to understand the profession. And I was asking why this, why that, why that, why that, about some professional issues inside the United Nations. And you know what struck me at that time, Yuri? That professional staffers, diplomats working at the United Nations, they in principle professionally agreed with me that yes, there are deficiencies within the United Nations system. But I remembered once and forever the most clear and I think up to the point answer I was given by one very experienced professional working at the United Nations at that time. He said, look, United Nations itself, it's nothing. It doesn't take decisions. Governments take decisions. Because the United Nations is the composition of the governments. So you go to the capitals, you argue that something is wrong, something is not right. You bring that voice of your government back to the United Nations. You take people working for the United Nations for the government, first of all, missions, to look at the issue, to have a consolidated position. then you rectify the deficiency you have noticed. Without the will of the governments who constitute the body of the United Nations, you will do nothing. And United Nations is as strong as the governments make it strong. And the governments in normal societies, which abide by the rules of the club, their members, and the United Nations is the biggest world club. And the rules for that club is, written down very specifically. So if you bring that to the attention of that club members and point out, look, this member of our organization has breached rule number 1, rule number 2, rule number 3, rule number 4, and all the rules which are inscribed in the United Nations documents. So what do we do about this? And here we come to the problem you are mentioning. The membership. Yes, there are ways of dismembering the member from the club membership. And the lawyers, specifically the UN lawyers, and also I think the governmental lawyers, legal departments, specifically of those governments who constitute the composition of the permanent 5 of the Security Council member, should look deeper into the issue. Because what happened back in 1991 when the Soviet Union was dissolving, I mentioned already the Declaration of Almaty of 1995, where the members of the future so-called Commonwealth of Independent States agreed in principle that they will not object for the Russian Federation successing the membership of the former Soviet Union in the United Nations. But that political pledge had never materialized legally, and that's the point. That is why the Ukrainian representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Kislitsa, is asking from the membership, please show me the legal paper.
I should interrupt you.
Yes.
I should interrupt you here and remind the audience that Mr. Kislitsa is your former student. So
let's not go personal. No. Yes, before taking civil service back in 1992, I used to teach international relations in Kiev University, and many, dignitaries, let me put it that way, yes, were my students, not only in Ukraine, but that doesn't matter for this specific conversation. Now,
no, I know it's just sort of to make it a little more lively and to for our audience to understand that there is actual continuity in what Ambassador Kislitsa is doing, and there is a very direct link in his line of arguing with what we're discussing today. So sorry for interruption, but I thought
no problem. How it all happened? I think we should look not only into 1991, when all these discrepancies with the continuing of the membership of the former Soviet Union happened. And that is basically the matter which our permanent representative is driving attention to. But also to the fact that the whole system of the United Nations had been incepted on American soil back in mid-40s. Let's look deeper. Let's go to, Atlantic Placenta Bay, 1941, where two leaders, one already at war, Britain, Prime Minister Churchill, and the United States President, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, were discussing the so-called Atlantic Charter, where they explored their vision and agreed their vision on what the world would look and should look like after the war. After the war. It was 1941. America was not yet at war. But the two leaders were already discussing what the world should look like after the war. I think today it's the year 2022. We still have war in Ukraine. Outrageous, inhuman aggression by Russian Federation against the constituent member of the United Nations, the first member, the initial member of the United Nations. Now, I think it's about time that responsible governments should look into what the world should look like after this war. And these responsible governments should ask themselves the questions, do we need such member of the club in this organization if this organization is at all relevant to the modern situation? Because the situation we had back in 1941 until 45 and the situation we're having today in 2022 are a bit different, to say the least. And
radically different.
Yes, yes. And yes, we are lucky enough that we have two initial members of the United Nations, Britain and the United States, supporting Ukraine by all means in this struggle against the aggressor. But let me remind them that they, back in 1941, were the two primary powers, two governments, who came about the idea that after the war, something should be done to prevent these things from happening in future. Later came the so-called Washington Declaration, when America was already at war and 26 countries, including the then Soviet Union, agreed to the principle of the Atlantic Charter. And that came about up until 1945, when in San Francisco the Charter of the United Nations had been signed and the United Nations came into being. And Ukraine was the initial member at that time. Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic it was called. Russian Federation, thinks that, once again, it thinks that it is a continuator of the Soviet Union. Now, I think in Ukraine we have enough political will and enough political consensus to say no. By the means of your behavior within the United Nations, by the means of you have breached every single rule within this organization, besides that negligence and legal protocol cheats, let me put it this way, which paved your way for occupying the seat of the former Soviet Union, you do not anymore belong to this club. And that should be obvious not only for us here, but also for other initial constituent members of the United Nations and to the wider membership. And that is why the idea that the issue should be at least brought to the attention of the General Assembly and discussed there came into being.
Another, first I would have a little observation here, and I'm interested in your opinion. The fact that Ukrainian SSR and Belarus were constituent members of the United Nations, back then, I guess this was a bit of a Stalin's ploy to have more voices. And it turned out that it was, interesting. Initially, obviously, Stalin needed more representations at the UN. That's why he went for Ukraine's membership, Ukraine's constituent membership. So that's. Do you agree with this sort of thing? And the other question is, I mean, the first question, it's just an observation. But the other question is, goes very much into the heart of what you said today, just now. In your opinion, like there are voices all over the world saying that the current security framework of the world did not work. So, and it is definitely, just like you said, definitely the responsible governments of the world should sit down and decide what do we do after this world to make after this war, to make the world safer and better place, and to definitely prevent such a horrible and unprovoked aggression as the Russian Federation against Ukraine. So, in your opinion, what do you think? Which path should the world take? Do we go along further reform or radical reform of the current UN structure? Or maybe, as some voices say, that UN has proven itself so inefficient and incapable of stopping this horrible nightmare, this war, that the entire security sort of framework of the world has to be totally rewound. So, which way you think? I mean, obviously it's a bit of a speculation, but in your own opinion, which way to go?
My opinion is simple. First, and the most important thing for today, not only for us Ukrainians, but for the whole good world, including the membership of the United Nations, which means almost 200 countries, is to deliver what is necessary to be delivered at the aggressor, so the aggressor leaves Ukrainian territory and is not anymore in a position to wage aggressive wars. That means defeat of the Russian Federation. That is the political priority number one, by all means. What comes after is second priority. But today we have a discrepancy here, as we have already discussed. We have an institution, the world institution called United Nations. And within that institution, we have the body which is called Security Council, which is specifically empowered to prevent the breaches of security. It's its primary goal of that institution within the United Nations. It is called the Security Council. Now, but the UN system is much bigger. It is not only the General Assembly, the Security Council, it has, International Monetary Fund, it has the World Food, whatever. It has, it's called UN family. You have, in Canada, you have aviation organization, and so on and so on. Yes. So on. Now, but the essential body of the United Nations system responsible for keeping security is not working. It is not working, it's just got stuck. Now it's more obvious than ever. So something is wrong there. Now we tell you, we know what is wrong. We have one rotten member there who should not be there. Simple. Obvious. Now, how to do that this member should be brought out of the club? Because it breached every single rule of that club. And we are suffering. Our people are dying, perishing. I mean, our cities and villages are being demolished. Now, with threatening by nuclear terror, they are not only threatening us Ukrainians, They are going wider. They want the whole world to be taken hostage. Do you need this sort of permanent member in the Security Council? Besides the fact that it does not have legal paper to be there. So do something about that. You have the legal department. You have the responsible governments, if you are responsible governments. Let's do something. Let's bring the rotten bully out of the club. For some time, at least, for 5, for 10 years. If in 10 years it behaves right, then we will consider maybe we shall pull him back, not on the permanent seat, but within the membership. That's how I look at the issue. But something should be done about now. And that is basically the point which I wanted to share with you during this discussion, because I don't think the ideas of just dismantling the whole universal system of the United Nations today is relevant in the sense that we should distract our attention to that issue. United Nations system, I started with that, has its deficiencies. Yes, it definitely has. Once again, I reiterate, only the governments make decisions. United Nations by itself does not make decisions. So it's time for governments. Look, the governments, you constituent members of the United Nations, you see, the main body responsible for security isn't working. Isn't working. And that's the huge problem, not only for us. Now with this nuclear terrorism, it's a problem for all of us. Let's do something about that. Let's leave it alone, the United Nations deficiencies altogether. We'll cope with it later, after the war. And we will look into how to rectify the whole system. But first, let's do something about basics. Basics for which the whole United Nations system was organized back in the 40s. And that is, once again, I will repeat, the preamble to the Charter of the United Nations, to save the future generations from the scourge of war. That is the main goal of the institution. We are all members. And that is something to be done today in order to prevent the, miasms of that terrifying regime which is now waging, I may even call it already the world war this Moscow regime is waging. Because after Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, it is becoming obvious in every corner of the world that it is not the war of whatever they call it, special operation. It's the war of attrition against humanity. So humanity should do something about this. And that's the point. Then, after we see that something is done on this particular issue, maybe we will have time and enough energy to think what type of world institution should we think about as the proper institution which will save the future generation from the scourge of war. Be it the United Nations rectified, be it something else, I don't know. I don't have an opinion on this. I know that one opinion with which I think most Ukrainians and many other good people around the world will agree. We need to stop Russians today. And one of these stoppage points is kicking them out of the United Nations.
Thank you, Igor. Sort of the main thing that I can make out of your last portion of our conversation is the following. Earlier you mentioned that for many, many, many years, Russia has invested billions and billions of dollars into its propaganda. into trying to sort of say that they are a normal state. I mean, obviously they dispel it all by their barbaric behavior. However, just again, just like you mentioned, now and this series of talks, you with me, are actually designed so that we can actually ask responsible governments of the world, ask people in English-speaking world and in the world in general, look, this is the major problem. People, talk to your governments, demand that Russia is kicked out of the UN. And that's the primary and the main objective of our talks. Because without this, with Russia continuing to, while breaking all the possible human and legal rules, continuing to be a member of Security Council, it's not only defies, rules per se, it defies logic, it defies common sense, and it defies basic. So Igor, thank you very much, and I think we will continue this, and I think it was a great and very productive conversation. I'm very much convinced that your thoughts will be very much appreciated by our audience in the West. Thank you very much.
Thank you.